be able to get through this in 20 minutes. Probably not as fast-paced as Elaine. She's much more versed at that than I am. But for me, for White Collar Factory today, it's about talking about the journey of the building, and particularly, of course, the role that concrete had, which is integral to that journey. The journey started for us as architects about 10 years ago, working across a number of buildings with the same client, our client Derwent London, who is a local property developer, investment company, working on a number of buildings. That's just 4 of the portfolio of buildings we've worked with this client on for over the last 20, 25 years. And it was a question they asked us about 10 years ago, coming out of recession, or really in the sort of depths of recession, how do we make buildings better? What is it about the old buildings that keep taking us back to those buildings which are 100, 150 years old? A lot of those buildings never intended to be designed as or used as office buildings, but 100 years later being converted as office buildings very easily. And you know, as Elaine's been saying already about this sort of future-proofing, robustness of structure, and the milk bottle effect, which I which I really like, by the way. It's about breathing new life into some of those shells. So we've been doing it with old buildings. The question was asked, why aren't modern buildings quite as robust? So we set about doing a bit of research, building a concept which we named the White Collar Factory, and it was a site, it was a concept devoid of site, devoid of planning, devoid of the external environment and some of those influences that otherwise enrich the architecture. And what we wanted to get to was a baseline. An economic baseline at this point is about £165 a square foot. And for us, it's about trying to understand every move you then make as architects, as designers, working in a place and all those influences, why you're having to make those moves, how it adds costs, and it's all going back to our base condition and our baseline, our shell, our milk bottle, to make sure that that's still a robust concept. So we developed a concept, we built a prototype. This was about 2,000 square foot, built 10 metres up in the air. We ran it for 12 months, gathered the data, proved that the concept and the computer modelling worked for us, and then we knocked it down and started again. So what we then did was find a site at the end of Old Street Roundabout, Silicon Roundabout, a sort of home for TMT tech sort of occupiers. We brought our concept onto that site, but of course the concept as a sort of 45 metre square box doesn't necessarily fit very well. So you then have to adapt it to suit the site conditions, to suit rights to light, to suit neighbours. All of those conditions we're also well versed in as designers working in a global city like London. In doing so, the building loses shape, gains height, wins efficiencies that way, but ultimately adds cost. So you can see we're up to about £200 a square foot. We developed from the prototype, from the concept of a prototype to the completed building, finished in 2017. Started 2017, now fully occupied, fully functional. We're gathering data, post-occupancy analysis. White Collar Factory is one of a group of buildings. There's a courtyard of buildings behind it with a new public realm in the centre. And through all of it, it's really about the role of concrete. And part of our concept was about what can we take out of buildings, what actually do you need for buildings? And it really comes down to structure, services and skin are the 3 things you need. So that's what we designed. And we also made sure that any one of those single elements did more than one function. So you have to have a structure, clearly. That structure also allows it to become the facade. It also, in our case, allows cooling for the building. So this building has no air conditioning. You open a window for fresh air, should the external environment conditions allow. The cooling is using that thermal mass that colleagues here will talk about in a moment. But we pass cold water through the slab, and the whole slab as a soffit sort of radiates coolth rather than heat, as you would expect in underfloor heating. So it's the reverse of that. It's not a new idea. We don't claim to be authors of it. Lubetkin used it. Frank Lloyd Wright used it. What's changed since those guys did it, and what we can enjoy now, is the technology of extruded plastics for the pipework, which means we don't have joints within the concrete. So all of a sudden it's an old idea borrowed and reinvented for the 21st century. So concrete as structure, as facade, as cooling, and of course as finish. We're not about to cover this up throughout the building. So to get there, I'm going to take you through some of the detail of the journey that we had to go through. Lots of people, much smarter than I am, looking at the detail of this. It's about scoping it out as architects very early on and working with our contractor. All the red that you see there is the Fairface concrete. Almost no plasterboard in this building, 250,000 square feet of net office space, over 17 floors. We have to detail it. We have to, of course, the designers in the audience will understand how lift controls, front door bell, all those sort of day-to-day functions of the building are left exposed by removing all those follow-on trades and finishes. You have to very early on detail and think about all that stuff right from the start. So to get there, we have a process with ingredients. That process starts with our contractor, Brookfield Multiplex, and it starts working with them, and targets for BREEAM and for LEED, the American accreditation, trying to get where we did achieve, although at this stage the target was a BREEAM Outstanding and a LEED Platinum, which we both achieved, basically by replacing a lot of the cement content. And we did that by playing with the mix, GGBS, PFA, types of limestone, Portland cement, sand and admixtures, a lot of which, of course, changes the colour, changes the way the concrete performs in how we build it and when we build it throughout the year. And of course, where we choose it from the batching plant at London Concrete, also has an effect. So all the way back to where they source their materials, and Elaine's already talked about that as well. So for us, the mix was important. Replacing cement with GGBS, we managed to replace 50%. We then added PFA, 200 grams of PFA to help darken it. And all of that was achieved through a process of mock-ups. The journey of the mock-ups started, this is, as it says there, tough, hard research, going to New York, photographing buildings. Annabelle Zeldorf on the left-hand side here, building for the Zwerner Gallery, about 10, 15 years old, fantastic facade, really sort of innovative in its market in New York, but also looking back at Yale and Saarinen, 1961, concrete looked even better. It just got better and better and better over time. So we sort of took homage from that, came back to the UK, to a sort of dreary London, built a lot of mock-ups to test different types of mix, to settle on then 3 mixes with different amounts of GGBS and PFA. We settled somewhere in the middle, which for us gave more of a sort of natural appearance to the concrete. We're then interested in the formwork of the concrete and the process of construction being manifested in the final detail of the building. So we looked at working again with our trade suppliers, looked at different types of timber, different thicknesses of timber, how you exaggerate the board marking on the concrete, day joints, working joints, horizontal and vertical joints, corners. All of these things are mocked up in a sort of larger scale. So we went from 24 mock-ups down to 3 test samples, and then into 2 mock-ups of our preferred versions. As sadly, with a lot of the construction industry, it involves a lot of middle-aged men standing around and pointing. Hopefully we'll see a change of that in due course. But we did select the concrete from that. We selected the details out of that mock-up and then secured that in a benchmark document which went into the building contract. I'm just going to go back a couple of slides. Building a mock-up of that size is one thing. Building it over 17 stories is something else. We then worked with our friends at Reckley to see how we can then fabricate a liner to produce the image of the concrete and repeat that in a jump formwork moving up. So we worked with them, again, back to mock-ups, back to more timber species, back to investigating how the timber has an effect of a concrete, how it cures, how the timber draws the moisture out of the concrete at varying degrees to give you different degrees of colour and shade. So in our mock-up we tested it again, created a mould on the left-hand side there in timber, identifying the largest part of a building for our single largest shutter. We did a timber mould, we then cast a rubber mould of that in Reckley and then used that to then repeat that mould again and again. So some of the sort of morally, I think it's a bit of a cheat. I can sleep safely at night because I know it is a modern form of construction. It allowed us to use the beauty of that concrete and I guess the sort of more heritage ideas about how formwork was used and bring that into the 21st century to sort of keep that those skill sets going. The concrete looks beautiful. I think I'm allowed to say it took us 10 years to get there. Having set all of that out, having worked with our partners, identifying all the elements, we then go into then scoping and detailing all of that out. So I'm going to whiz through this because a lot of you will understand this, but it does demonstrate the amount of effort done by the whole team, architects, engineers, designers, and the supply chain and the contractors to get this right. So it's about understanding those build sequences, however that might be, in the vertical elements for our facades, which again are doing a lot of our structure for us, insulating, twin wall construction, pumping the concrete in when we have walls of some height. Some of the walls were up to 9 metres tall. You're left with the scars of that process on the right-hand side for the pumped concrete at that level. You're left with the scars of that concrete, of that process. We set those out on the drawings because we wanted those scars to be evident. It's part of the process of the manufacture. So why hide it? We're aware, obviously, with jump form, the way that the system's repeated, with the way that jacks work in pushing that jump form work up from one floor to the next. You're left with a different type of scar, which we could coordinate into floor zones, some of which are exposed in some of the taller elements, and of course on the staircases, where we have those vertical elements right the way through the building. And you can see there that the jump form going up through one of the stair cores, and some of the scars that are left as part of that process, all left on show for the finished version. Columns, this one was from our show suite, our working prototype, which we felt was too shiny, but it was a consequence of the formwork used. We then looked at other benchmarks in buildings, and again took walks around with contractors on all of these buildings to work out different types of formwork and the most cost-effective way of bringing this building together. Identifying that we know we're going to have seams, again those kind of scars of a process, and also identifying these are all from the site sequence. Despite all that hard work and that sort of benchmarking of a document, you still get that amount of variation. We didn't touch any of these columns up. They are still all like that in the building. They do change over time. The column on the left-hand side here, your left I think, has lightened over time. We resisted doing anything to this concrete, so as struck, we left it, let it dry, let the building get sealed and heated. The concrete changes over time. Just like Saarinen building at Yale, 40, 50 years later, looked even better. We hope our building does the same. Slabs, using standard formwork, bringing the rebar down, laying our embedded, so at that point, concrete contractor stops, pauses, our M&E contractor comes on, lays their pipework in, extra reinforcements put on, concrete's cast, it weathers, we have to be aware of that. What we don't want to do is for it to be weathering from within. Common question that lots of people ask is, how do you stop contractors drilling into the pipework? Simple is, we just give them free drill bits, which are only 30 mil deep. So we didn't have a single sort of incident of anyone drilling through any of the pipework. We set the formwork out. Again, we weren't too precious about it as architects. We just said, start at the bottom left corner, work your way through. We're not interested in lining joint lines up with anything. That's a finished soffit as struck. Here it is today with the surfaces on there. Again, no touching up of that concrete after the shutters were struck. Of course, part of getting to all of that is precedent buildings, is taking contractor and the subcontractors and their supply chain through a lot of buildings which we've been involved with, of course, and also the client has, and going back to those a number of years after they were completed and saying, well, look, they're still looking fantastic, they are getting better with age. Managing expectations, because the more you talk about this with trade contractors, the more they feel, well, the price is going to go up because you're going to be very difficult as an architect. The exact reverse was the case. We wanted to be really relaxed with it. So we took them to a number of buildings, very different finishes of concrete on those buildings, on vertical and horizontal elements. And then we set up a benchmark document that captured all of these as a working methodology, which we all signed up to. So this was a collaborative document between us, the engineers, contractor and his supply chain. So we knew from the start everyone's expectations was managed. We all knew what we wanted and how we were going to get there. Of course, you can't stop this happening. There were some slightly ruder ones than that, but actually I quite like that piece of artwork. It might still be there actually. Snagging, of course, there's a lot of snagging takes place at the end of construction. We pick up on a lot of these items, but actually don't do anything with it. we waited until the very end of a job before the contractor walks off, before we start thinking whether we have to go back and remedy any of those. And in fact, I think a lot of those scars and blemishes are still there. Towards the top of the project, in fact, on the last story pour, unfortunately our friends at Duns went into liquidation. I won't go through the details of that, but it was a shame because they had done an excellent job, and they kind of stuck with it literally through to the bitter end. And I'm going to finish just with a few images of the building completed. So almost 2 years in, fully occupied. Anecdotally, we hear from a lot of building occupants and our visitors that there's one thing a lot of them love about the building, and they stroke the concrete. They come in, touch it, which is, I guess, an unintended consequence. Oily finger marks are starting to appear around lift controls and so on. But robust external facade around the base of Old Street Roundabout, which is quite a gritty environment. Concrete has a presence there, has a place there. So it goes from around the base of the building, comes into the inside of the building. So this is the reception hall. Nothing is added to this space. Structure, services and skin is all that makes up that space. I guess the one addition is the floor finish, and the one bit of fun we allowed ourselves was a yellow track on the soffit, which is lighting, which moves around following the reception desks that also move around. So you can move reception out of the way and use this as a function hall, or a sort of town hall, if you like, instead of just a reception hall. So you see the concrete there, different elements coming together, different mixes, different types of construction, all secured with our benchmark document, accepting that there will be variation between walls, columns, soffits, outside and inside. But you create this space for people to inhabit. People come from, the occupants come from their own tenancies down and have meetings in the reception of this building rather than using their own meeting rooms. It's good enough. I sometimes joke, we want concrete good enough to eat your dinner off it. We had concrete good enough to project the building directory onto. So this isn't paint, this is a projector. So we can turn that off and just enjoy the concrete. But it's a mix of occupiers in this building. Very robust building, but we have tech people in there, we have creatives, we have a bank, we have an insurance firm. It's a real range of occupants who want to be in this sort of building. Institutional occupiers as well as creatives as well. And you create this amazing texture that people stop, wait for a lift, stroke the concrete. Inside and out, the way that daylight comes in and hits the concrete, the idea in that shutter of working with different thicknesses of timber to accentuate some of those panel joints, those subtleties that we learned from the benchmark and the mock-up process, all comes to fruition at this point. Typical walls on the floor plates, idea about how there's a kitchen extract duct behind that sort of concrete plug, so that can come out. A tenant could plug his kitchen into that. So again, back to future-proofing. If he doesn't want a kitchen, he can put a window in it. Staircases precast against in situ. Again, no finishes on the staircases, as delivered, including the nosing, which were cast into the yard. So those are there for 100 plus years. Concrete, the main staircases open to the lift lobbies. So if you're waiting for a lift, you can see the staircase. You're encouraged to use it. Towards the top of the building, where our friends at Duns had sort of lost capacity, let's say, the concrete wasn't brilliant, so we ended up using some external timber and bringing that in and helping masking some of that. So rather than taking that concrete down and throwing it away, we kept it. It wasn't quite right in terms of tolerance, but then we covered it up with timber. And that affords you access to the roof terrace. You have to have a roof terrace when you're at height, because it affords you views like that. Thank you very much.